with about 1 million other people across the world in a climate march because we're starting to realize that everyone will be affected by climate change. The urgency of climate change, though, has never been more apparent. Earlier this year, the Third National Climate Assessment Report came out saying the same thing that the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel has been saying since 1988. Humans' burning of fossil fuel has significantly altered the atmosphere. The result, for the last 50 years, the temperature has been rising faster than it ever has before in history. Now, climate change is of an urgent concern because of a thing called positive feedback loops, as shown here. As temperature rises, the Arctic sea ice melts, and ice reflects, but the ocean absorbs more sunlight, and so when you have more ocean exposed, you have more sunlight absorbed, so more ice melts. This is a positive feedback loops, and once enough of these feedback loops are passed, these perpetuating cycles will spiral into a trajectory that we will be unable to stop. Now, given the nature of this concern, you would expect world leaders to be coming together to do something to address this global threat. This is not the case. In fact, climate change has been largely ignored. Here in the United States, we're home to the largest population of non-believers of climate change. 1 in 4 Americans are skeptical about climate change. Now, I did my project in conservative communities. So first let me define what a conservative versus a liberal is. Conservative views are mainly based on hierarchy individualism. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, conservative ideologies include pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. It depends a lot on self-reliance, and this is why they look up on people who are rich, because they have worked harder and they deserve to be praised, not taxed. And they see poor people as just people who have not worked hard enough. And the individualism is what sparks the freedom to own guns, or the freedom to be free of environmental regulation. Now, liberal views are mainly based on egalitarian communitarianism. And so this is based on the principle everyone is equal and we should do what's best for the community, even if that means inhibiting the rights of the few to protect the many. So this is kind of the egalitarian is kind of why liberals believe women should be paid equal and that gay people should have the equal rights for marriage. And the communitarianism is why they believe in gun regulation and they believe in environmental regulation. So then you have in United States, our liberal party is the Democrats for the most part, and our conservative party is the Republicans for the most part. Republicans are usually seen as red, as shown here. The Democrats are usually seen as blue. The more far left Democrats are sometimes seen as socialists. The more far right Republicans are seen as like the Tea Parties. So the states, as you can see here, the red ones are mostly in the South and the Midwest, and the blue ones are mostly on the coast. Now, it may look like there's more blue states, but because it's based on population and the coastal states are more populated, it evens out for the most part. So Seattle's over here. This is Washington. It's a blue state. I did my research at Purdue University in Indiana, which is right here. This is a red state. So why conservatives? Of all the different communities, why did I choose to study conservatives? Well, one of the largest indicators of whether or not you believe in climate change in the United States is your political ideologies. Democrats are 3 times more likely to believe in climate change than Republicans. When you look at the more far-right Republicans, such as the Tea Parties, the number that believes in climate change drops to the single digits. But perhaps it's not their fault. You see, climate change has been entrenched in a cultural war. Many people's first introduction to climate change in America was through Al Gore, a liberal politician. And climate change offends many conservative values. Some conservative values include keeping the status quo, free market capitalism, and smaller government and less regulation. Climate change has been named the market's biggest externality. Many say that the solution to this is regulation on both a national and global scale. This, of course, creates dissent in many conservative communities. So, because liberals and environmentalists have been leading the conversation about climate change, the messaging has been inherently liberal. For example, many people, the mascot of climate change is a polar bear, but how many of us have actually seen a polar bear in real life? And I'm not talking about a zoo. It's likely that none of us have seen a polar bear in real life, so what they're asking us to do is reduce the quality of our lifestyle to prevent a bear's demise that we've never even seen before. Likely, that will only work to an environmental crowd. And then the other mascot of climate change is the picture of the starving African children. Now, this picture has been overused, and we've grown desensitized to it. And it's easy to become desensitized to this because many of us don't have friends or family in Africa, so this is kind of much more far away. But a picture like this, Hurricane Sandy ravaging the coast of New Jersey, hits a lot closer to home here in the United States, quite literally. Many of us have friends and family on the coast, and so when we see something like this, it becomes more personal, and thus the importance of messaging. So, my hypotheses are, within conservative communities, I predict if we use conservative values to talk about climate change, it will be more readily accepted. So for hypothesis 1, I'm going to focus on renewable energies job creation. For hypothesis 2, I'm going to use a more local versus global argument for climate change. I'm going to use state versus national, and I'm going to use God's creation versus responsibility for future generations, because statistically conservatives are more Christian. So my methods were, I created 4 different surveys, and I rotated them out with the liberal and conservative messaging. I sampled in public locations, and over the course of 6 days, we surveyed 223 people. So within my methods, as you can see here, the blue text is the liberal text, the red text is the conservative text, and these are the 2 different questions I asked. Now, each person only got 1 set of these types of questions. And so you can see state versus national, responsibility to steward and protect God's creation versus conserve natural resources so there'll be enough for future generations. So, in my results, I got 80% believed in climate change. This is much higher than the general population. And I think there's 2 reasons for the reason I got such a high percentage of people who believe in climate change. Part of it was that a lot of the sampling was done in a college town. People who have more education tend to be more liberal, and so it's likely that I got a higher percentage of liberals because 49% of my population had a college degree. On top of that, when surveying in the conservative communities, I was met with a lot of hostility when talking about climate change. I was even kicked out of a county fair, and they wanted to shut my research down, and it was very hard to even talk about climate change within these conservative communities. And with the more far-right conservatives, they didn't even want to take the survey. So it was hard to really gauge their opinion. What I did find with those who would talk to me was that many wanted international pollution limits, and they blamed China and India for the pollution, and they didn't want pollution regulation in America, but they thought other countries should do it first. So when asking whether or not they support renewable energy, I found no significant difference between the liberal and the conservative messaging. When asked about like whether or not climate change is caused by air pollution, when I used a local versus global, there was still no significant difference. When I asked between state and national, I found a slight difference, but then neither wasn't even an option. It's just that so many people wrote it in, I had to place it as an option. When asked whether or not we have a responsibility to protect future generations versus God's creation, there's still no significant difference. When I asked, do humans believe in climate change, we found, as you might expect, a higher percentage of conservatives believed that that humans did not contribute to climate change, about 41%, versus the 10 or 11% of liberals. What should we do about climate change? About an equal amount of conservatives that we should, and liberals that we should do nothing or wait for a scientific solution. More conservatives that we should adapt to climate change, and more liberals that we should prevent climate change by reducing pollution. But the interesting thing here is 47.7% of conservatives believe that we should prevent climate change by reducing pollution. But if you remember, when asked, do you believe humans contributed to population, only 40% believe that humans contributed to climate change. So what does this say? What I found was a larger percent would agree that pollution is bad for health reasons than would agree on climate change. And I believe this is has to do with cognitive dissonance, where in admitting that climate change is real would go against their values, and since they didn't want to do that, they refused to admit climate change is real, but they will agree that pollution is bad. So from this, I think that we should transform the debate from the science of climate change to focus on the solutions of climate change. Because, we can't even get people to agree on the age of the Earth. And we don't have enough time for them to, try to convince everyone that climate change is happening. If we can just focus on the solution, which is to reduce our pollution, everyone can agree that pollution is bad, whether it's for the health reasons or it's because of climate change. The solution is the same. So for future directions, I want to expand my sample size, and I want to make it more representative of the general population, so less people with college degrees, more conservatives, and so in order to do that, I will have to find out how to engage those on the far right in conversations about climate change. I also want to test use different messaging strategies to see if it can change behavior, see if it can get people to become more sustainable and see themselves more as global citizens. So I'd like to acknowledge Purdue University for letting me study there, and the McNair Scholars Program, and Dr. Prokoby for hosting me in her lab. And thank you very much.